And then industry, nonprofit professionals. I mean, you can see that it's an incredible mix of people, and I think it is this diversity here that makes this meeting so very special. So that is going to be a theme throughout the day. At a break, after a session, find somebody who you don't know. We have these purple and green lanyards, which they make seeing the name hard because the names are so low. But if you see the purple, that's a family member, and the green is generally a professional. So I think everyone here wants to meet somebody new. So lean out of your comfort zone, if you will, and meet somebody. Okay, let's see. Oopsie. Okay, so I confess that after all these years, I'm even more humbled and sobered by the magnitude of these issues that bring us here today, and how hard it can be to make progress. So let me remind you all while we're here. So globally, 125,000 or more epilepsy-related deaths a year, and that's definitely an underestimate, I would say. The risk of premature death for people with epilepsy is 3 times higher than the general population. SUDEP is the leading cause of total life years lost, second only to stroke. It's a pretty powerful statistic that we all continue to use because it really describes the public health burden of this problem. People with epilepsy have a 7% lifetime risk of SUDEP. And in the US, more than 6,000 people with epilepsy die each year from possibly preventable causes. So PAME's mission, as you all know, is to convene, educate, and inspire all stakeholders, all those hands we just raised, to promote understanding and drive prevention of epilepsy-related mortality. PAME's hallmark is working together to understand and prevent. So the evolution of PAME. As we said, we started in 2012, and then just a few years ago, whereas it was once a static meeting, a few years ago it was reimagined to be an annual meeting, but also to have ongoing educational opportunities throughout the year. So we call it PAME 2.0, and it's more than just a meeting now. But it's the same mission, working together to understand and prevent epilepsy mortality. But we now have a larger reach. We've tripled conference attendance. We've expanded the committee work. We now have a SUDEP prevention committee, a policy and legislation committee. We've enhanced our communications through our website and our social medias. We offer 4 to 5 webinars a year, and we are working on joint advocacy opportunities. Oopsie. Oh, okay. So here's an example of the webinars that ran this year, and we're grateful for everybody who participated in those, whether as a panelist or as a viewer. They are still available on the website, and we're constantly open for new ideas for webinar topics. It continues to turn out a lot of people, so please come and share new ideas with us. This was another work product this year of the Legislative Task Force. We developed a state advocacy toolkit in collaboration with a number of the nonprofits in the room. A breakout session after the plenary today will be on this if you're interested in learning more. And we do have copies of this toolkit available. It will be at the registration, and it's also online. Okay. So the planning committee. Sorry, I'm looking for my notes. So when I say we have done all of this, I really mean we, because PAME exists for its partners and because of its partners. It's the volunteers that make this engine run. And to that end, I want to thank this year's planning committee, who are all seated here on the stage. I'd like for each of them to introduce themselves and maybe share a little bit about why you've been part of PAME or what inspires you about PAME. But endlessly grateful to you all who worked really hard all year long to bring in new speakers this year, identify new topics, and just make this meeting what it is today. So thank you. Allison, you want to start?
Yeah, happy to start. So I'm Allison Kukla. I'm Senior Manager for Programs and Partnerships at the Epilepsy Foundation, and I co-lead planning Family Day with Mary Duffy, who is in the crowd, but she is my rock as we do Family Day. What inspires me, being a person with epilepsy and learning about SUDEP from Gardner when I got involved in advocacy work and not from my provider, which we know is not how that should happen, but we know often that is how it happens, is the community that we build in Family Day. I think we felt that love and connection when we were doing the roundtable discussions yesterday that I had to stop, unfortunately, after so much wonderful discussion and hearing laughter as families and loved ones were sharing their loved ones with each other and making connection, and just feeling that love in that room yesterday and hearing individuals share their loved ones, their vulnerability to share their stories is just so inspiring to me. And I appreciate everyone that, participates in Family Day and, is here today also to share their stories with you that you'll hear throughout the day. And as, Mary and I said yesterday and Gardner pointed out, take the time that you need. If something is too hard or too heavy, there's a quiet room that you can go to, or as we said yesterday and Maggie shared yesterday, if you need a hug, come find us. Mary and I are from the Midwest. We love hugs. We give good hugs. But come find us if you just need someone to listen, if you need to cry and need someone to sit with you, feel the feelings that you need to feel. We're here for that, and that's, what inspires me about PAME is that you can be yourself, you can feel your feelings, and be here together. And everyone in this room respects that. And I can pass it to Lisa.
Microphone issues, so I'll show.
Hi, my name's Lisa Bateman. I am an adult epileptologist and a SUDEP researcher. I work here at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. I have been impacted by epilepsy mortality both in my professional life and in my personal life. And so that motivates me to continue doing the work I'm doing, to be part of this community, and to really strive towards reducing mortality for people living with epilepsy. That's why I'm here.
Hi, good morning. I'm Gordon Buchanan at the University of Iowa. I'm a adult epilepsy doctor and a researcher. I've been coming to PAME since 2012, initially as a trainee, and now I'm up here. So it's been nice to kind of be involved with this kind of throughout. This is really an empowering meeting. It's great to hear about the updated science and updated clinical work from the professionals, but it really helps ground us to remind us why we're doing what we're doing, to meet the families and advocates and patients. It's been incredibly powerful, and now I get to bring some trainees to the meeting, and they're over there in the corner. So yeah, and so it's nice to share that, kind of show them why we're doing what we're doing. So thank you all for being here.
Sorry. Good morning. I'm Robin Whitney. I'm a pediatric neurologist and epileptologist from McMaster University, which is in Ontario, Canada. I started coming as an epilepsy fellow when I was doing research with Elizabeth Donner on SUDEP and SUDEP risk factors in the pediatric population. And then I've continued to do some work on SUDEP communication, and I'm incredibly honored to be invited to be on the planning committee this year. This meeting is, really special to me. Integrates both, clinical researchers and clinicians and families, and so I'm just really incredibly honored to be here today with everybody. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tom Stanton with the Danny Did Foundation, which is based in Chicago. And when I think about PAME, I think about the first meeting that I was at in 2012, and how, as a family member being there, how families that are new to this meeting may feel. And just that realization that there's a community of researchers and scientists who are working on this awful thing that has happened to so many families in this room, gave me comfort and gave me some hope. And just the gratitude, to Gardner and Dr. Buckhalter, Dr. Donner, and many others who have dedicated their careers to working on this issue is really inspiring. And I just want to thank all the families that are here and who were here yesterday, who shared their stories. Maggie in particular, just the courage to put your family and your pain out in front of a community. And I hope you find some comfort being here, and that we keep in touch, and definitely encourage people to interact with people from different groups, because I know that gives them a lot of motivation as they go back throughout the year to come and work on this issue and ultimately try to find a solution and ways to prevent SUDEP and other forms of mortality. So thanks for having me.
And last but definitely not least, because we would not be here, but for Anne.
Good morning. I'm Anne Gramiak, Senior Manager of the Epilepsy Leadership Council and Partnerships with the American Epilepsy Society, and it's my honor to be working with the planning group running the logistics for the conference. This is the only event like this with the AES annual meeting where AES partners to be part of creating content. So we're very pleased to be a part of PAME and planning this meeting. As logistics person, I could say the most important part of this meeting for me is the memory wall. And it's the reason why we're here, and it's the thing that I spent the most time on. This year we have over 90 people in memory, so please stop by and remember why we're here.
Thank you, Anne. No. Can we all give Anne a big round of applause? Because honestly, she is. She does an incredible amount of work all around, all year long, making all this possible, and we're deeply grateful. I am here now to run through a bunch of thank yous, and before I start all these thank yous, I want to thank you, Allison and Mary, wherever you are, for yesterday. They organized, as you've heard, the family meeting, which I thought proved to be another powerful convening of families who gathered to support one another and to hear, I don't know if I have a slide, from those on how to turn grief into action. So I just thank you for making that possible, and most importantly, thank you for all of the families that were there. It takes a huge amount of courage to show up. So please continue with the feedback on how we do that better. Personally, we had a networking session at the end, and I love meeting some people and hearing their stories. And there's so many people here whose grief is so raw and happened within the past year. So thank you for being here. Okay, that was the family day. I did have a slide. Okay. This doesn't really want to go. There we go. Okay. So, a lot of thank yous here. So these are the lists of the committees, and in your program you can find the individual members that participated in all these committees, the Research and Prevention Committee, the SUDEP Legislative Task Force Committee, the Community Outreach Committee, the Leadership Committee, and the Abstract Review Committee. It's a lot of people volunteering to make all this stuff possible. So thank you so much. If you're on one of those committees, can you raise your hand so we can, thank you. I know you're around, you're not raising your hand, thank you. We also welcome newcomers to this effort. So if you're sitting out there saying, hey, I want to get involved on any of these, or you have ideas for new ways to get involved, please let us know. Okay, and so now I want to share some exciting news. While PAME is almost entirely dependent on volunteers, we're excited to be growing our capacity. In January, Allison Kukla will join the team as PAME's Senior Advisor for Outreach and Education. Yay! Many of you already know Allison from her time at the Epilepsy Foundation, where she has stood out for her leadership on SUDEP issues and her support for the bereaved. She has been a tireless epilepsy advocate and has worked in partnership with many groups over the years to advance common causes. We're fortunate that she has developed a special place in her heart for the PAME community. Alice embodies the spirit of collaboration, and we are so thrilled and lucky to have her join us next year. So welcome, Allison. And I also want to thank all of the organizations who support PAME. First and foremost, thanks to the founding organizations, AES, Cure Epilepsy, the Epilepsy Foundation, and Danny Did. And a very special thank you to AES for serving as PAME's fiscal sponsor and for providing extremely generous in-kind meeting planning and logistical assistance. People often think PAME is its own nonprofit organization. It is not. We are an initiative housed within AES and receive tremendous support, so we are so grateful. So these are all the companies. We would not be here with all of these supporters, and we're really proud that this list has grown over the years, and it's a diverse list, and they're all really, really important to making this possible. Some of them have booths out there that I hope you can visit. I hope you can talk to them. The pharma companies are real partners in this space and are helping us to communicate messages around prevention in really important ways that I'm honestly continuing to learn about. So thank you to industry partners, thank you to the nonprofit partners, thank you to the academic partners, and to the smaller family foundation partners. All of your support matters. Okay, and now the abstract presenters. So this year, this is a hallmark of the conference. This year we have 42 poster presenters. They are in this room back here. So all the food for the meeting is out there, and then the poster room is next to there. And after the conference today from 5 to 6:30, there will be the poster reception. So I all hope you please attend that. It is really one of the most amazing parts of the meeting to meet the young scientists and to hear about this emerging work in this space. And it's, I think, breathtaking to see the variety of research that is going on and the new ideas that keep coming forth. Okay, some quick housekeeping items. There's 3 lunch option items this year. One is you can have lunch in the room. The other option is if you are if a scientist interested in networking, you can go to the El Capitan room, which is that way. So to go to the breakout rooms, which are over there, you have to exit behind you and go that way. And then if you're interested in the family networking lunch, that is in the Orpenheim room, if that's how you say it. We always ask that people please keep questions broad and applicable to everyone, so not try to make them too personal, please. The evaluations are super, super important. We actually read them over and over again and try to iterate this conference and be responsive. And we will have a QR code. I think there's a QR code in the program, and we'll also throw it up, or it's right there. We've already encouraged you to meet somebody new. Oh, the Family Lounge. This meeting can be hard, and it can be hard for the families especially. So if you want to just duck out and have an escape, the Orpheum, how do you say that? Orpheum room, is the Family Lounge, which is around the corner. Okay. What have I missed for housekeeping? That's good. Well, and I guess this is the last item. As Anne so eloquently already mentioned, the virtual memory wall is another hallmark of this meeting, so please spend some time. It's out front here. It's also in the registration area, and it'll be displayed on these big screens during break. But I know I walked out of the bathroom and ran right into my son in my face, and it was like powerful. And so thank you for all of you for sharing photos and stories of your loved ones. Doesn't want to go. Maybe it's over. Oh, okay. Okay. So now I think we can transition. Thank you all so much. And we're right on time. I guess while Libby's coming up here, I didn't mention, so the format of the meeting today is just as it's been in the past years, which is plenary at the front end, and then we have 2 breakouts, and the breakout rooms are over there. Oh no, the one breakout room is there, and then the other breakout room stays here. So plenary, 2 concurrent breakouts, lunch, 2 concurrent breakouts, and then the plenary session. Everyone comes back in here for the final plenary and the closing. Anyway, have a seat for a second. Okay, so now it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, a woman who, despite the unthinkable loss of her beautiful and breathtakingly creative son, has shown resilience, strength, and determination, and has turned her pain into action to help others and save lives. Libby Boyce is the president of the Cameron Boyce Foundation. This foundation honors the legacy of Cameron Boyce by aiming to cure epilepsy through funding research, education, and awareness campaigns, while still supporting causes that were important to Cameron. In addition, Libby is a licensed clinical social worker who works for the Los Angeles Department of Health Services as a deputy director for Housing for Health, which provides housing and services to people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles County. So I'm super humbled and inspired by Libby, and I'm really grateful for her being here today to share her story and to start this year's meeting. Thank you, Libby. Thank you for all you're doing. And thank you for being here yesterday. Libby and the Cameron Boyce Foundation helped out a lot yesterday. So.
I know there's the slide. I don't know if you switch it. There's one slide. Yeah, let's push to that.
There we go. Okay, just one slide.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm resilient and I cry a lot. Older people in the room will get this. I have to see which version, the little print or the big print, depending on the glasses. Which one works? Okay, I think that one works best. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the City of Angels. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome to our lovely city. Hopefully the weather's a little better than wherever you're from. My name's Libby Boyce. I am the mother of Cameron Boyce, and he's a young man who died of SUDEP when he was 20 years old. Cameron was an incredible and giving human. He had a light inside that was so bright, and it was just a joy to be in the same room with him, never mind being lucky enough to be his mother. Cameron was also a fairly well-known actor who had developed a large community of followers and friends, and I mention this because it led me and his dad to establishing the Cameron Boyce Foundation to ensure we use his voice because he could no longer use his voice, and our voices to increase epilepsy awareness and to reduce the shroud of mystery and stigma that surrounds epilepsy. The ins and outs of living with epilepsy, especially for young people, and also empowering people living with epilepsy to have the best information to live their healthiest lives. While the Cameron Boyce Foundation is focused on epilepsy awareness and education, this cannot be separated from the depth of stigma that has in many cases made epilepsy an immobilizing condition. Sometimes the fear and concern of how others will view you or treat you become more overwhelming than the condition itself. And I believe this is the case with epilepsy, especially for young people who they're already self-conscious about everything, even without any health-related issues. Why? Why is the stigma of epilepsy so intense? I started my career as a medical social worker, and I worked with people living with HIV and AIDS for many years. The stigma of HIV and AIDS was particularly awful in the beginning. I mean, I had to don like a whole spacesuit just to go see somebody who was living with AIDS. And now that stigma is so vastly reduced, if you think about it. This makes me really ponder why the stigma of epilepsy persists. Why do people living with epilepsy keep it to themselves? Why do they not seek care and treatment and support? Why are they more likely to be unemployed? Why is there a lack of representation and safe spaces for sharing their experiences? This stigma hurts our cause. It hurts efforts to get more funding and research, and ultimately, it hurts the people experiencing epilepsy. On top of all of this, living with epilepsy can be very stressful due to the feelings of lack of control. It is not predictable. It is not structured, nor is it organized. You can't schedule it or explain it well to others, so it consistently feels lonely for people living with epilepsy. One of the dear people I've met on our journey shared that the only time he's not worried about having a seizure is when he's having a seizure. Let that sink in. I remember Cameron having these feelings even though he only ever had 5 seizures in his life, from age 16 until his death at 20. He felt very isolated after having a seizure, and he felt as though his body was betraying him. It's critical to give power to individuals to control their epilepsy. And you do this by giving them tools, knowledge, support, and by inspiring them to be their own best advocate. They're key to finding the balance of their own seizure control. And this will hopefully reduce the number of seizures experienced and in turn, reduce the number of people who die from SUDEP. My challenge to those in the medical community who are here and elsewhere, and they're the lifeline of epileptic patients, is to use your powerful positions to peel back some of the misconceptions and myths about epilepsy and to be the best steward you can be, to be honest and thoughtful with your patients, especially younger people who are much less able to process living with the reality of a chronic illness. You're more than just doctors to these cases. In these cases, you're the doorway of a critical juncture and significant life event for newly diagnosed who deserve to be fully armed with information. The good, the bad, the ugly, the potential pitfalls, how to notice their triggers, what things will likely cause more seizures, what they can expect when they start their medicines, taking it on a schedule, what to do if they have breakthrough seizures, what breakthrough seizures are, and yes, that it can be fatal if it's not taken seriously and or well treated. I've heard from many doctors and medical professionals that of course they cover these things, but somehow it is either not being transmitted in a way that can be absorbed, or it's not being heard, and that's the challenge. Because of our having lost Cameron, people reach out to us a lot. I have talked to so many families having a family member or themselves living with epilepsy or who have lost somebody to epilepsy. And what I hear over and over is that there's a resounding chorus is the lack of information and visibility regarding many of the very common aspects of epilepsy. I know every doctor or medical practitioner in this room understands the importance of your role as a healthcare provider and your obligation to discuss epilepsy and what can be expected, how to treat, the medical interventions, options, etc. But it's also important to address the myths surrounding epilepsy. Examples of this: epilepsy is not a mental illness. In history, everybody thought it was. It's not a mental illness, but depression can occur secondary to the diagnosis. Convulsions are not always the visual indicator of a seizure, but you should still take your diagnosis seriously. You should be able to live a stable and fulfilling life. However, you cannot ignore your diagnosis. Discussing the stigma of epilepsy head on is critical. Take the time to get to know your patients and help them find the balance to thrive despite their diagnosis. There's nothing like having a great healthcare team and feeling heard by your provider. I hope that we are collectively able to move the needle to improve the care of those living with epilepsy and the associated stigma. In turn, this will save lives. I thank each and every one of you for being here, giving it your all on behalf of the epilepsy community. I hope that we can continue to come together like this in the wake of my family and other families' personal tragedies to give us purpose, help us grieve, and to motivate us to do more to empower and support those living with epilepsy. Thank you. You want to? Questions, anybody?
We've got time for questions. I don't know if there's a mic that we could pass around, but maybe people want to know more about the Cameron Boyce Foundation and how you are tackling some of the stigma
Or
as well.
response to my words, too. Welcome. There's one back there.
Libby, thank you so much. As I spoke with you yesterday, this was amazing. You are making me cry. My question for you, as a person who grew up with epilepsy and experienced everything that it's still making me cry, experienced everything that you described, how did you know any of that before Cameron died?
No. I did not see an epileptologist. I didn't even know there were such things until probably a year after Cameron died. I had no idea. We had no idea about SUDEP. The medical examiner told us that's what he died of. And then we had to go look it up. But I mean, I don't want to blanketly say that no doctors do this right, but in our case, it was not done well, and we didn't have any information about even the medicine he was going to take, or like really what epilepsy was. It was minimized, so we didn't go do our own research. I think part of that is I'm as a social worker, I read medical records a lot about the unhoused, and I saw seizure all over the place. Well, that was secondary to substance use, and so I thought, oh yeah, that's, we just were all lulled into not really thinking about it and minimizing it, and that stigma, that fear of telling others. If you really, really have to think about that in comparison to other illnesses, other chronic diseases, that stigma is not the case. I mean, the AIDS one, to me, it's really stark because I just remember it so much. And now it's it's still stigmatized, but nothing. So what's up with epilepsy? It's been thousands of years that it's been stigmatized.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for your comments and for all the work you're doing. And I actually had a question that follows very nicely to the comments you just made about stigma. I'm a neurologist, a child neurologist. I treat children with epilepsy, and I'm wondering what to actually do about the stigma. How can we, from your experience, attack this stigma? Because I agree, the stigma of epilepsy is severe. I see lots of young people in my practice, some of whom are living very well with their epilepsy, the way Cameron did. And I ask them about whether they, are willing to tell their friends or talk to their class or do any kind of advocacy, and they're typically not comfortable doing so. So how do we combat that?
Yeah, there's really no easy answer to that. There's no silver bullet here, but I do think that certainly healthcare providers, you're more than just an MD to folks especially for newly diagnosed. And I think it's just important to talk about it, to bring it up. and talk about it and say, you know, this is the reality, and this is why I don't want you to go down the path of not getting the support that you need. And I'm here to talk to you at any point about, like, it's really opening up your heart a little bit and talking about it. I think that's number one. But I think, like, the Cameron Boyce Foundation is really trying to tackle this through podcasts, helping young people. We have created support groups for them to talk and find community. It's really about community and helping clients to sort of think about how they can approach this with their friend group, how they can approach this with their employer. We have work to do, but we need to do it collectively. And I think all of them, the main My Foundation, Cure, Epilepsy Foundation, we're all thinking about this. So I'm hoping we can come together at some point and do some campaign around the stigma. I think we just have to do that. We need to figure out how to do that. It's costly to get PSAs out there and so on, but I think it's something that we need to really be completely overt and candid and in your face a little bit about. But no silver bullet. I wish there was.
It's okay. Hi, Libby. My name's Philip Pearl. I'm from Boston Children's Hospital. I learned about Cameron through a news clip, USA Today, I think, and I've actually used that clip in teaching about SUDEP and awareness. It's amazing to hear you this morning. I didn't know until last night that you would be the keynote speaker. My question to you is, it's been 5 years since Cameron's passing. You have your finger on the pulse of families more so than many of us do. Is it your perception that there's less of this unawareness that you described in that newspaper article? It said in that article you guys were unaware of this threat. And if you knew, you might have, or Cameron might have done things a whole lot differently.
Yeah.
In the 5 years you've been working on this, do you perceive, or are families still saying we had no idea this could happen?
100% say that. And when I'm not kidding you, I've never heard a family say that they were well armed. I mean, that's truly my reality, and it's painful. It's really painful, and that's why I speak a lot to the medical community, because, you know, I've worked in it, so I sort of know how doctors think, and not everybody, obviously. We always had, like, the docs that would do the right on the social services side, and the folks that wouldn't. Our case, they didn't do right. And I've heard all of them say they were not armed. All of them say they didn't have all the information. All of them, not a one said they were well armed. Some have better experiences than others, so that's a glimmer of hope. You know, after Cameron died, I just heard, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do this? And can you imagine that? You're like, oh my God, it's all my fault. Like, to put salt all in your wound in the most traumatic way in life, that you lose a child and then you're hearing all the things you should have done that no one told you should do. And then you can blame yourself because you didn't go on the web and figure it out and all of that. Why? Because, like I said, we thought he was safe in his bed. He always had his seizures in his bed. I didn't know that he would stop breathing or his heart would stop, because the brain needed to rewire, and in those minutes, he was going to die. We didn't know that. And so we thought, well, he's in his bed. If he won't fall, he won't drown. So it's just incumbent on the medical community and the healthcare team to be honest and to talk about these things. So much better. And I have heard from a lot of doctors that they use Cameron. Use Cameron. Use him. Save lives with him, because that's what he would want.
Good morning. I'm Raquel Quarles from Morehouse School of Medicine. I work with people with epilepsy, specifically Blacks with epilepsy, and we started an epilepsy community advisory board, and the stigma that you were talking about is absolutely real. People are still in the Black community believing, that it's a demon or various things, and so it's not shared. But I think that what you were saying, that we really do have to speak freely and openly and more about epilepsy. Yeah. I remember being struck by one of my advisory board members, I want to say 2 years after we'd started the board, that she made the comment, "This is the first time I can say I'm an epileptic and be okay with saying that." Her family wouldn't even let her talk about it. So it wasn't even about her not being wanting to tell her family, but her immediate family, who knew her condition, didn't want her to speak about it. And so it's not just the person with epilepsy.
It's a community, the village around them.
It is. And so I agree with you. We have to make sure that we are speaking freely, openly, and we try to have events where we are talking freely about epilepsy and what the experience is of people with epilepsy, as well as their family members and support givers, and how they are experiencing it. So I thank you for all that you are doing to raise awareness about epilepsy. Thank you.
I want to respond to something you laid down there, which is communities of color often do not have the most trust in the medical community. Some folks, English is a second language, and so on. And it's very easy to just dismiss that, but it's so important because communities of color are going to be less apt to seek treatment and support. It's just the reality. And so we have to be aware of that, and we have to know and delve into that with every person you see. Find out a little bit about them and their experience in the world. It sort of is a call to add a little social work skills to what you do, because every person is going to be different, is going to go out in the world in a different way. And it's just really important to hear their story and hear where their concerns are and respond to that to help them, to hold their hand a little bit. And you truly are a lifeline, and that can't be taken lightly. Thank you for that.
Hi, Libby. Thank you so much for just being here today. I know we met briefly, and I'm sorry, we do also share the worst thing imaginable. I lost my son, Jackson, right before he turned 18, also young man, similar, very scenario, 8 years ago. So I want to ask first, are you presenting at AES at the big conference? To me, that is so, because
maybe next year.
We need to get her at AES, like on a major platform. If there's anything, I'd be willing to help to do that, because to me, it's like the people who are at PAME, my experience, everyone that comes here, the medical community, they all get it, they see it, they understand the statistics are not right. We're not looking at it from live lost. And I don't understand how SIDS is so well known as a campaign, but we can't have anything around it, suit up. And I appreciate AES and all they do for PAME, but it needs to be in the limelight of AES, because that's the community to me that needs to like see this and be and to help.
Yeah.
And be inspired, because I was the same thing. I was told after my son's second seizure, sorry, I'll try to keep this quick. Hey, there's no reason for your son having seizures. He's going to outgrow this. And that was like an amazing thing, that my son was going to be okay.
Yeah.
And it was such a false sense of security. And my husband and I are very well educated. We didn't do anything. The same thing. You can kill yourself with the what ifs because you didn't do the research. You thought your child was going to be okay. You trusted your doctor, which is only as good as their education. And they don't have a lot of this around epilepsy. But if we get the statistics right and the SUDEP known, I don't know if we could ever get it like SIDS, but to me, I think it would be huge.
100%.
I know I covered like 3 or 4 different things, but going to AES, I just didn't see enough around SUDEP the first time, and it kind of killed me when I went, and I've never gone back to AES yet. Yeah. So, all right, that's maybe being too honest. All right, okay.
Well, I just want to say one thing in response, which is I always feel guilty because I am just one parent who lost a child to SUDEP. And again, because of my son, I have this voice, but there are so many out there. I feel guilty because why should I be the one standing up here? So if there are opportunities, I'm happy to be lead and all of that, but there are so many families that need to get it out. So I just do that plug too, because I always do talk about there is a village of families that are in the same boat as us. We're just parents. We're parents. And we lost our child to this. And, you know, it's a community. It's a community, and we need to be heard.
Good morning, Libby, my friend.
Hi, Lou.
Hi. I appreciated the challenge you threw down to the medical community because you know my story. You and I have collaborated on this subject many times, but for the medical community in the room who don't know my family's story, beginning in 1996, all three of my kids at some point have or had epilepsy. And so from 1996 up until 2022, the passing of our daughter Brenna from SUDEP, there were, in my estimation, 80 missed opportunities during doctor visits with neurologists and epileptologists for a family who had 3 kids dealing with epilepsy. So, and much like you, as we've discussed, we didn't learn about SUDEP until a week after our daughter's funeral. And just like Barb said, we weren't armed with what we could have done to potentially mitigate that risk from occurring. So I'm a little tired of hearing that, well, it's a rare occurrence, that's why we don't want to unnecessarily have the family living in fear. That is no longer, in my opinion, an acceptable response to why aren't you informing about SUDEP. So it's our risks and it's our right to know. And so, again, I appreciated the challenge you threw out to the medical community. This isn't me pointing the finger of blame. This is just me agreeing with you that we need to do better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple things too there. You know, you said something that I find very interesting. A lot of the medical community say it's rare. It's underreported, way underreported, because we know very well that a lot of the medical examiners are not putting this on death certificates. And there are so many families that don't know, that even come on the support group, Allison, that runs it, and they come on and they haven't even heard of SUDEP yet. Their child died of SUDEP. So, yeah, very serious stuff. And of course, underreporting means less research, less exposure.
So hi, I also want to echo the appreciation for you sharing your family story. So I have a daughter with a genetic epilepsy, and we were educated early on, and I'm wondering if there's a difference in typical and these genetic epilepsies that are much more compounding. Yeah. But the thing I wanted to also say is your comment on the AIDS epidemic and the striking difference is really hit home to me. I have a brother who was hemophiliac, and we lost him in '93 to AIDS. And fortunately, he was diagnosed after the worst of that stigma had subsided, and I'm grateful for that. But that parallel is powerful, and I think we need to bring that to the forefront, because if you can reduce the stigma to something as scary as AIDS and HIV, we have to be able to reduce the stigma. And then one other thing, my teenage daughter's she's an adult now, but when she was a teenager, one of her best friends was diagnosed with epilepsy, and that young lady did not want anyone to know. But we had already been living with Samantha's epilepsy, and my girls told her, Absolutely, that's not an option for you. Your people have to know, your family has to know, which of course your parents did, but extended families, your friends, your teachers, and when you go off to college, you need everyone to know so you stay safe. So my kids shouldn't have been the ones educating her on that, but at least they were.
Yeah.
But thank you again.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that because I hadn't thought about it. But most of the people that do contact us are folks who don't have a child that has had multiple seizures every day all their life and have other developmental disabilities, either because of epilepsy or prior to epilepsy. I bet there is a difference. I bet there is a big difference because I think if you're, at the hospital a lot or you're going to the clinic a lot, you're probably going to get a lot more information. I think in the cases where a teenager has their first seizure and everything else is normal, that it's different. It's treated differently, I would guess. There's a research. Where's the doctor from yesterday? There's a research question for you. I imagine that's quite different. And thank you to everybody letting me write this because that's when it just hit me about AIDS when I was writing this. It was just like, because I'm thinking about stigma a lot. Like, I just, I read a lot of history stuff, and like almost every book I open, somebody in the family had epilepsy and they went to an asylum, and it's like, so I'm really thinking about it a lot because I think about that, the history, and then like, it's really not changed too much.
Hi. This is Dr. Newton from CTC Epilepsy Program. First of all, thank you for your great presentation and information sharing. And it's not surprise to me, I heard your story that SUDEP awareness is still a problem because we still don't have ICD code for SUDEP yet, even though we have been pushing this for many, many years. I remember in 2018, a group of us, including Oren Deminsky and other doctors around here, we have published mortality position paper for medical examiner and coroner office to try to address the SUDEP. However, we still didn't get the ICD code approved yet. So every time when I do research, when I go to the last step, I always found there is a limitation because we don't have ICD code. This prevents us to have accurate surveillance for SUDEP. I hope this sense can be improved in the future. Thank you.
I hadn't heard that. That's terrible. So ICD, if I'm correct, there's a doctors and others use a code to code somebody's diagnosis. Am I getting that right? And that's what and there's no code. Is it for SUDEP? Very interesting. How do you get it there? Oh, the question back to you is how do we change that? Anyway, I think it's something for us to think about is, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but it's something, there's always unintended
as a government
consequences.
agency, we cannot involve directly in this business. This depends on many family and non-profit organization. All of you should make effort to try to push these things, and we can do what we can do.
Have we tried this?
Thanks.
Is it legislative? It's legislative.
It's on the radar.
It's on the radar. I hear it's on the radar. There you go, somebody from CMS. Anything else? Any other? One more.
I'll wrap up. I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to you. I'm a parent of a daughter, 22-year-old daughter who lives with uncontrolled seizures and who was also a huge fan of Cameron. And so she said, please tell Mrs. Boyce. Thank you from me. So thank you for everything you're doing to raise awareness. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that my daughter is my hero. She did not like to talk about it for many years. And then when she started having seizures at high school, we gave a presentation to her class, actually. And on a positive note, I gave most of the presentation because she did not feel comfortable, but she stood up there with me. And I thought, please don't let there be crickets when I'm done. And the students had lots of good questions. And, oh, my sister has epilepsy. I didn't know, Caroline, that you did too. So there's hope, but there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you.
Yes. Crickets are the worst. Thank you. Have a great conference, everybody.
I just really want to thank Libby. I mean, that you are so openly sharing Cameron with all of us and encouraging us to use Cameron's story in the clinics and in the public. I mean, it's a really incredible gift because not many people in the public eye come out and talk about their epilepsy. And so you are helping to mainstream this issue and destigmatize it. And I also love that you all work specifically with younger people because that's where change is going to happen. So thank you for really the important work you do. I encourage all of you to check out their work on their website. It's really phenomenal.
And I'll just say, Cameron would want us to do this. That's why we do it.
Yeah, I know.
You would be like, go tell him.
Well, he is very proud of his mom because you're doing amazing stuff. So thank you, Libby. Big round of applause for Libby. Okay, and now I'm going to welcome up to the podium Gordon Buchanan and Lisa.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Gardner. Since I'm the first one up here speaking, I think we need to take a second and give Gardner a round of applause for all the work that she's been doing for so long. Thank you, Gardner. Okay, so I'm here to introduce the first plenary session. We're talking about all-cause mortality, what we named Enhancing Early Recognition to Drive Prevention. This meeting, has been a lot sort of historically about SUDEP, but there's obviously everybody here knows that there's lots of other forms of mortality associated with epilepsy, and so we're trying to highlight that a little bit more this year. So we've assembled a nice panel of speakers. First, we're going to hear from Kelly Sweeney Widman, who is a bereaved parent. And I'm just going to tell you briefly who these people are, and then I'll introduce them as they come up. Larry Hirsch from Yale School of Medicine, who's going to talk about mortality related to status epilepticus. Sophie Bennett, who came to us from London, so quite a ways for us, from King's College. She's going to talk to us about morbidity and mortality associated with mental health, and a little bit about mortality associated with suicide. And then Rama Maganti is going to talk to us about the morbidity and mortality associated with sleep disorders, and focus on the mortality part, I think. Okay. Okay, so I went to the wrong page in my thing here. Okay. Great, so first we're going to have Kelly come up. Kelly is a registered nurse from Tacoma, Washington, and she is an epilepsy advocacy champion for the Epilepsy Foundation. But today, most importantly, she's the mother of Reese. She's going to share her story about Reese with us, and I'll leave you to read the rest of her bio in the program. Thank you, Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. It's an honor to be here to talk about my son. My son's name is Reese Widman, and the title of my talk is Lost in a Therapeutic Dose. Like I was introduced. I am a nurse by trade. I just recently became an epilepsy advocacy champion for the Epilepsy Foundation just a couple of months ago, and was asked to speak here, and my answer was, of course, yes. My most important role is Reese's mom. Disclaimers about my talk: I intend to create no more stigma. I want to break down the stigma surrounding epilepsy, medications, treatments, mental illness, and suicide. This talk will include discussion of suicide, just as a warning, a trigger warning to anyone out there. This is my boy. We're going to spend a couple minutes just getting to know him. As a baby, he was chubby and drooly and loving and just happy. He grew just as happy. He was so energetic, loving, a fantastic person with a huge heart, and definitely charismatic. He's our son. He was my buddy. His baseball buddies started calling me Shelly, so he called me Shelly often. Just a little cute term of endearment. I was a night shift nurse for 22 years, so he'd stay up a little bit later with me, and we'd watch memes and TikToks and have just great laughs, watch some TV shows. And his dad, who's with me today to support, he was his dad's best friend. They did everything together. Reese was an avid baseball player, and his dad was one of his coaches from little on. Reese is a brother. He has an older brother that's 30 years old. Reese was 17 when he passed, so they were about 10 years apart. In one of the pictures, you see that he was the best man at Rob's wedding. They loved watching The Office, so he is called the bestest mensch. So it was adorable, and it was the Reese show. He did all the readings. He did it all. It was during COVID, so it was his show to be had. He was a family member. He was the baby of both sides of our families, and our family gatherings are not the same. He would see what he could get away with the grandmas. He would like to get a rise out of them, and often would, in the middle of opening Christmas gifts, he would twerk just to see what Graham would say, and just to get a laugh out of everybody else. He'd play jokes. He would always have us laughing. He's a friend. He had so many friends. We filled an auditorium with 1,100 people for his celebration of life. The church had standing room only. He was so loved and still is. He had a girlfriend, so many friends that he would just be around and go to basketball games, go to the movies, play poker, play golf, all the fun things that they learned during COVID that they could do, a lot of outdoor activities. They made it work. Video games, a lot of video games, but they were together through the mics, and we all heard it echoing through the hallways. Oh, a competitor. Reese loved baseball. He was such a good baseball player. He loved to pitch. He was very good at it. He was signed to play at a college just 5 minutes from our house. He was supposed to go there the fall of 23, and he was supposed to be the top of the league for his high school league that year. He's an explorer. He loved Disneyland. We joke. We live in Tacoma area in Washington. We joke that he's been to Disneyland more times than Seattle because he loved it so much. He was, I think he was 10 or 12, and he still had his autograph book going to all of the characters. He just loved it, loved the rides, everything about it. And he was just a big kid, just like me and his dad. We just have such a good time there. Being a baseball player, we were taken to all different places to explore, and he loved all of that. We'd go to different states that maybe we wouldn't have gone to because of baseball. He was able to go ziplining in Utah. We went to Hawaii just on a family vacation. He did love all the scenery on the road to Hana. He just really, really loved that. And the Grand Canyon was breathtaking. He didn't complain about getting up early to see the sunrise over the Grand Canyon. He didn't complain about staying late to watch the sunset. He was mesmerized by the beauty. He was a goofball, definitely a goofball. Anytime he could make somebody laugh, he would. And he couldn't contain his laughter either. He'd start laughing. In the picture in the Letterman's jacket, he was trying to be serious, but laughing hysterically at some off comment he did. And the chocolate milk, that was his favorite. And again, he was trying to see what he could get away with from his grandma by drinking out of the gallon. And of course, he got a little, Reese, don't do that. But again, his little smirk, he could get away with anything. Reese was diagnosed with epilepsy in 2020. January 19th, he had his first seizure-like activity. It was just jerking of his arms, a myoclonic seizure. We went to the ER. They said, I don't think it's a seizure. I think it was just that he stayed up late. He was at a sleepover the night before. And I said, I was in denial at first. And then finally, as I was Googling in the ER, I said, I think it's totally a seizure. And he said, nah, it's fine. I said, are you going to give a neurology consult? The doctor said, no, you don't need it. So the next day I called his pediatrician and I got that neurology consult. But it was still going to be a few months before we were seen again. 2 weeks later, he went out for another sleepover, and he texted us in the morning and said, it's happening again, come and get me. And so immediately we got in the car, went and got him, went to the ER, and he was still having that seizure-like activity, and they expedited his visit to the neurologist. So on February 4th of 2020, we were able to see the neurologist. The next day, he had an EEG, and the day after that, we were called with a generalized epilepsy diagnosis. Those were the only 2 seizures he had. Depakote was started right away. He had a little bit of a side effect with Depakote, just a little bit of weight gain. He was on it for a full year, and then he got this horrible abdominal pain, which was diagnosed as pancreatitis related to the Depakote. Education was provided about the Depakote medications and the side effects. And then, like I said, he developed pancreatitis in 2021. So then he went on to Klonopin just for a short time until his pancreatic enzymes came down to normal, and then we can move on to a different anti-seizure medication. In spring of 2021, he started zonisamide. In spring of 2022, his zonisamide levels were not yet therapeutic. They had reached a therapeutic zone for a little bit and then dropped. So we increased the medication dosing. And then summer of 2022, the therapeutic level was achieved. I would say that Reese became more moody during that time. In hindsight, we see that he acted more like a teenager. He was always a little bit of a late bloomer, so we thought, okay, he's just acting like a normal teenager, and wrote it off to that. In November, we noticed more and more of withdrawal from the family, from me and my husband, Corey, specifically. He acted pretty normal with his friends. Like, he went out to basketball games, still went to the movies with his friends. A week before he passed away, he was playing poker at a friend's house. He, like Libby was saying with the stigma, he did not want to share about his epilepsy diagnosis, and he did not share with his friends. The only people that we insisted knew about his epilepsy diagnosis were parents of the friends if he was going for a sleepover, so they were aware, or if he was going out on a boat or around water, that they were aware that he had this, had epilepsy. Now, he didn't want to say that he was struggling with mental health issues, just like he didn't want to say that he was struggling with epilepsy or that he was diagnosed with epilepsy. He held it all in and declined to take any help from outside people to deal with what problems he was struggling with. So unfortunately, on January 7th of 2023, Reese sent a text message to me and his dad telling us that he had been struggling with his mental health for about a year and that he was planning his suicide. He said goodbye. He left us instructions to help other people and to not let others harm themselves. He left behind 13 notes to various people, grandparents, his brother, different aunts, uncles, their families, and then to his baseball team. He left a note. And in that note, he left this quote that we use all the time because we need to use Reese to help other people. Use Reese's name and his beautiful face to help other people. He said, "Do what I couldn't do, get help." Because even in his darkest time, his heart was so big, he was looking out for other people, which he did throughout his life. Like when he was little, Corey asked him, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And we thought, army, policeman, something. He said, "I'm not sure what I want to do, but I know I want to help people." He was 7 years old. Like he just knew he wanted to help others. So what I ask is to normalize the discussion of mental health and suicide. We ask for standardized screening for depression and suicide risk. When Reese was at his neurology appointments, initially we were told about the side effects of the medications, having abnormal thoughts, hopelessness, depression. Those side effects crept in, just snuck in. So we ask for your awareness and really, really keep an eye out for that. Because yes, the hindsight, we think that medication played a part into him not being able to deal with his stresses for a 17-year-old life. So another thing with the neurology appointments that we were at, he was asked about his mood, but there was not a standardized screening for depression or suicide risk. Since then, we've worked with the neurology office, and they have implemented that screening, which we are very proud that they did this. We have no blame for anybody. The neurologist took very good care of our son, but that needed to change. We needed to have that normalized discussion of mental health. If it saves one person, it is worth it. So that is what we ask from the medical community, is that risk screening is completed at every visit. There's no reason not to. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk to all of you and for your attention.
Well, thank you, Kelly. It was really moving speech. We're not gonna take questions after each talk. We're gonna do a panel at the end of the whole session. Do you have time? Oh, we have time. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're gonna move right into. I think. Yeah, here we go. Okay. All right. So our next speaker in our plenary is Dr. Larry Hirsch. He's a professor of neurology at the Yale School of Medicine. He's the academic chief at Epilepsy and EEG and director of the Comprehensive Epilepsy Center. Larry's been really involved in SUDEP since the beginning, helping to organize the original meetings, and he's been really a powerhouse in bringing forward ICU, EEG, and really helping to understand status epilepticus. And again, I'll let you read the rest of his bio in the program. But Larry, thank you.
Hi. Let me just start with saying thank you to Kelly. That was amazing, incredibly moving. Everybody here is either in tears or on the verge of it, and I think we probably need an entire day or more session on suicide prevention and depression screening and all that. I think this one there's more awareness, but it's certainly not managed well, and mental health care in general in people with epilepsy has a long way to go. So thank you very much. And it's extremely hard to follow that immediately, especially since I'm not talking about suicide. But we'll hear more about it next. The only other point I wanted to make in listening to all the comments earlier, there's still a very long way to go with SUDEP, awareness and prevention and education. But I can say, having been involved with this since well before the 2012 meeting, there has been incredible progress. Just the fact that there's a meeting like this regularly is just an incredible thing. Yes, there's certainly people talking here is a little preaching to the choir, and we need to get it out to a much broader audience. But it's out there. I think epileptologists are all extremely aware of it. There's been funding from many people, specifically on SUDEP, between CURE, AES, NIH has had specific funding. There have been major sessions at AES many times on SUDEP and mortality and epilepsy. I remember the first time the president of AES called for all the doctors interested in SUDEP to meet together. I think there were 4 doctors who showed up. I think at least 3 of them are in the room now. And that was probably 20, 25 years ago. It was first talked about. At that point, everyone was told, just say, you're fine, live a normal life, don't talk about it. So there has been incredible progress in the amount of research. It's really amazing, but yes, there's still a long way to go. All right, so now I'm gonna did my clock already start? I guess so. I just used up half my time. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about status epilepticus. The only disclosure relevant is I will mention a rapid EEG device, and I'm a consultant for the company, Cerebel. This we're gonna talk about some definitions, mortality rates, its relation to SUDEP, predictors of mortality, concentrating on potentially modifiable ones, the importance of early detection and treatment. Okay, so status. It's rather simple. The definition of status epilepticus, it's really just a prolonged seizure. Virtually all seizures stop after 1 to 3 minutes. So it's defined as more than 5 minutes, and that's actually gotten shortened over the years. It used to be 30 minutes. It can also be any other seizure type besides a convulsive one that lasts for 10 minutes or longer, or if you have back-to-back seizures without full recovery, that's also considered status epilepticus. Refractory status just means you failed 2 medications, and super refractory means you failed 24 hours of anesthetic level treatment. Either you're still seizing or you seize when that's taken away. So that's super refractory status. This all really came out of the International League Against Epilepsy with the formal definitions. And they did point out that at least for convulsive status, we know that after 30 minutes or so, you start to get brain injury. For the other types, it's a little less clear, but we do know that it can happen with prolonged seizure activity with most seizure types except the absence, where we don't know of any possible injury. The forward button is dying on me. There we go. The only other definition to be aware of is if your seizure burden is more than 20% on an EEG, meaning you're seizing for more than 20% of the time, that is now considered status epilepticus as well. The other condition of a severe presentation related to status epilepticus is NORSE, and I've run a big research program on this. So NORSE is just refractory status epilepticus with really no explanation in the first day or two, no obvious explanation in someone who did not have prior epilepsy. It does include viral infections or autoimmune diseases that were not known at the time but present as status epilepticus. Oops. FIRES is another term you'll hear. So this stands for febrile infection-related epilepsy syndrome. It's a subcategory of NORSE where people suddenly present with these prolonged severe seizures, but it was after a febrile illness. It's usually a common, typical one, and then a few days later they'll start having seizures. And this can be at any age with the current definition. So FIRES happens in kids and adults. Okay, what about mortality rates? So in children with status epilepticus, it's about 4%. In adults, somewhere around 16%. Particularly high rate is in what's known as non-convulsive status, and this is mostly people in intensive care units or in coma, and their EEG shows they're having lots of seizure activity. But they have a very high rate of mortality. It has been shown in those patients that for every hour of seizures, there's a statistically significant increase in the risk of death. So it's not completely the etiology, which is a big driver of it, but also the seizure activity itself. Okay, something happened to the colors on this one. But, so this is the different incidences and mortality of the different subtypes. So overall, there's about 45,000 people per year with status epilepticus in the US. About a third of it is refractory, meaning it fails at least 2 meds, and they have a mortality of somewhere around 20%. About 1/5 of those refractory ones qualifies as super refractory, and their mortality goes up a little more, somewhere probably around 30% overall, with only about a quarter of them actually having full recovery or close by the time of discharge from the hospital. And then about 1/5 of refractory status also qualifies as NORSE. The mortality in that is about 23% overall. And even in those who survive, there's still a significant number who die with long-term follow-up, recently published. And then the survivors also have a lot of cognitive and psychiatric issues later, and often epilepsy as well. This is just from our current research programs. We have a big biorepository. We have found similar numbers, so it has not improved dramatically, at least, over time. We're still seeing 21% mortality in hospital with patients with NORSE, and 25% by 1 to 2 years. When looking at how many develop epilepsy in our series, it's only 57% by 1 year, whereas in the literature it's higher than that. But the majority of patients also have cognitive and behavioral issues. This is a very recent paper that looked at not just mortality in the hospital from status epilepticus itself, but it turns out it's actually a risk, a pretty high risk of mortality after. So one study showed, actually it wasn't a study, it was a review of all the literature, showed that by 10 years after status epilepticus, 57% of patients have died, and that included 20% in children. It mostly plateaued after 2 or 3 years, and it was mostly explained by other illnesses or comorbidities that the patient had at the time that they developed status, so it was known at the time. And then rates of epilepsy after status epilepticus. So status epilepticus itself can cause brain damage and cause epilepsy, and we believe it can also worsen pre-existing epilepsy, although that's a little harder to prove. But you can see some of the numbers on the rates of epilepsy after status epilepticus. There are substantial rates, including recurrence of status epilepticus in about 17%. This is a review of all the published literature on it that showed over time, so times on the x-axis there. You see purple is the adults, and the blue color at the bottom is the pediatric. And you can see it does go up over time, which is something that has been not well studied. This is a study particularly on mortality from status epilepticus in people with known epilepsy. So the annual rate is about 1 in 1,000 in children who are living in a residential school and have major learning disabilities. And overall was 2% of deaths in this study. In low and middle income countries, it was much higher. It was 13% of deaths in people with epilepsy were from status epilepticus, which was about the same as the SUDEP rate. So why do people with status epilepticus die? So this is certainly very similar to a lot of the research you hear about SUDEP, where single convulsions cause all kinds of physiologic effects. We can imagine just a prolonged convulsion can certainly do that into a larger degree. So this was one of the studies showing cardiac injury and how common it was. Really 2/3 of patients as adults, had evidence of cardiac injury. There's also brain injury, and that's from too much excitatory activity, too much firing in the brain can cause effects on the neurons itself, and that is all exacerbated when you have problems with your oxygenation, with fever, and with other metabolic problems, which most patients with status epilepticus do have. I'm going to skip that in the name of time since I talked too much in the beginning. Okay. So what is the relationship between status and SUDEP? So this was actually very recent, like in the last month. This review came out on this. And they talk about the overlap in risk factors and several other things with status and SUDEP. Risk factors, things like childhood onset epilepsy, developmental epileptic encephalopathies, alcohol abuse are risk factors both for status and for SUDEP. There's a lot of overlap of clinical features, including the cardiac effects, the respiratory ones. Having a history of status epilepticus is actually a risk factor for arrhythmias, including cardiac arrest. Status itself, we know, can cause drug-resistant epilepsy. And some studies have compared those with controlled epilepsy to those with drug-resistant epilepsy. And the ones with drug-resistant epilepsy were 3 times as likely to have had status epilepticus in the past. And we know status can cause recurrent drop in oxygen or hypoxemia and can cause lower heart rate variability, and both of those have been associated with SUDEP risk. So what are the predictors of mortality and status? The biggest one is the etiology or comorbidities. So the lowest rate is actually if you have known epilepsy and have status epilepticus. So most of them do well, but certainly not all. Age, seizure type, EEG findings. It was a very recent study showed a level of specialized care where if you had a dedicated ICU EEG monitoring program, you had better outcomes. That was actually a single center showing before and after they created that in Switzerland. Duration of status is shown in many different studies to be a predictor of mortality. And seizure burden, just how much seizure activity total. So these are the ones I think are most important to talk about because they're potentially modifiable. So your level of care and the amount of seizure activity you have. This is just from the paper showing the creation of an ICU EEG program. So they found that by creating this program of just recording EEG 24/7, not necessarily watching it in real time, but somewhat close to that, and they found they could double the rate of detection of non-convulsive status epilepticus. They reduced the status duration, and there was a higher chance of returning to their baseline function. Okay, so there's a bunch of scales out there that predict mortality and status, and I'm not using them to talk about the scales, but just they have identified all the predictors, so that tells you what's important. So the things, again, that are modifiable here in this particular scale, the STES scale, there's really nothing. So none of these are modifiable. This is a different one, it's much more detailed. Again, etiology is a huge predictor of outcome, and you get different points depending on which ones they are. The only thing here potentially modifiable are the EEG findings, but this is really EEG right at the beginning. So again, not much that can be done. Another scale that's looked at long-term survival after status did find that the duration of status, that's what's in that yellow box and is hard to read. It says duration of status epilepticus. So that was one of the 3 things that they found to be significant predictors. And here's you see the different points you get on this score. So duration of status is in hours listed there. So if you get into 100 hours or more, that is just as much of a bad predictor of outcome as being 80 years old. You see it has a major effect. All right. This just shows another very recent study that tried to be more thorough and look not only at clinical features, but also at a bunch of biomarkers in the blood and in the spinal fluid. But even having done that in detail, the status epilepticus duration was still one of the 3 major predictors of worsening from baseline. They also found a bunch of other biomarkers that are interesting too. Some looking at just non-brain organ failure, and some looking at brain injury itself, some reflecting like white cell count was a measure, but status epilepticus duration was still important. There are many studies now looking at seizure burden and how that relates to outcome, not necessarily mortality, but more about brain function and cognitive outcome. So this is one of the classic ones on that, actually from Sick Kids in Toronto. And they found if your seizure burden was more than 20% in patients in the pediatric intensive care unit, there was basically all patients had worsening in their function by discharge. Again, not mortality, but just function. And this shows the first column there shows the maximum hourly seizure burden. And the second one shows the odds of worsening on this pediatric functional scale. And you can see there's really a dose response there. The more you're seizing, again, that's just maximum seizures in 1 hour during their stay. It really has a big association with their functional outcome. All right, that's from the same paper. This has been shown in adults too, so this happens to be one in subarachnoid hemorrhage patients, showing the amount of seizures they have on the x-axis and the chances of an unfavorable functional outcome at the top and their cognitive score at the bottom. So the more hours of non-convulsive seizures, the worse they do in both of those measures. There's another very recent study, so large they were able to look at all these different subgroups, so acute brain injury, hypoxic ischemic, that's cardiac arrest. The lower left is people with epilepsy before, and then the last one, systemic illness, means no brain injury, just things like sepsis and severe medical illness. And in every one of them, the seizure burden was associated with the chances of poor outcome. Okay, so what can be done about it? So we know the total amount of seizures makes a huge difference, and we also know that the faster you diagnose seizures, the easier they are to treat. So that's been shown in animals and humans. If you diagnose it very early on and give a drug, it will work much more often than if you give the exact same drug much later after they've been seizing for longer. It will not work. So this was one study that actually found the time to getting an EEG was an independent predictor of outcome in neonates and children. This is a different study looking at children from the Pediatric Status Epilepticus Research Group, again showing time to treatment was associated with outcome in status epilepticus. And they used 10 minutes as the appropriate timing. If you could start it within 10 minutes, that was considered timely, and if it was later, it was considered untimely. And they found patients who received untimely first treatment had a higher odds of death with a odds ratio of 11. So they were 11 times as likely to not survive. So because of data like this is just one example from Philadelphia where they created a special pathway to try and speed up the time to EEG, to reading it, and to treating. It was really just all practical issues. And they found by creating this pathway, they could, first of all, get the medication given much faster, but even more important, the last bullet, they found that the initial drug was much more likely to stop seizures after they had this pathway. So 67% versus 27%. Okay, so I said I would mention this rapid EEG. So this shows the crucial importance of diagnosing seizures quickly, especially non-convulsive seizures that can be hard. So this is just an example of one of the rapid EEG systems available. It's basically a belt around the head and a handheld device. It takes about 5 minutes. In this study, they showed it took a median time of 5 minutes to get an EEG, whereas conventional EEG took about 4 hours, and this was in major academic centers that do a lot of EEG. And a very recent, again, this just came out in the past few months, they found that they compared patients who got this rapid, called point of care EEG, and compared it to a very carefully matched group of patients, same severity of illness and age and all of that, who got regular EEG. And they found the ICU length of stay was much shorter in those who got the rapid EEG. So it was 4 days versus 8 days. And that outcomes were significantly better in the group that got this rapid point of care EEG. So this is something that's available now, and it's showing that it will improve intensive care unit length of stay and outcomes just by getting a rapid EEG. All right, so just to wrap up, the pathophysiology of mortality and status is almost certainly related to that of SUDEP. and status epilepticus itself may increase risk. Many cases of status are probably preventable or could be stopped sooner. So in addition to more rapid in-hospital treatment, we can do more rapid home treatment, and we actually now have multiple approved treatments for aborting seizures at home. That's another huge advance in the past few years. So we have the nasal benzodiazepines primarily, with new ones, new versions of that coming out soon. So I think that is a big one in helping to prevent status epilepticus. We need more public education and ways of treating faster in public. So I always, whenever I see the AED signs on the walls in airports and things, I think that should also include an anti-epileptic drug for AED. But at least in airplane kits, make sure you have something that is not mandatory right now, and it's up to each airline, and many of them do not. I just confirmed that with Joe Servin this morning. Use full doses. That's also been shown. People often underdose when they're treating status epilepticus, and that leads to worse outcomes. And as I mentioned, probably most importantly, diagnosing quickly, treating seizures, paying attention to seizure burden are all going to improve outcomes, because those are the modifiable ones. So use rapid EEG, have a streamlined system or pathway, and include continuous EEG monitoring for that. And with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Larry. That was fantastic. I think you did a pretty good job with your time.
I gave you the time to thank Kelly, because we should all thank Kelly.
There you go. I'm having trouble moving this. Okay, here we go. And again, we'll bring everybody up for a panel discussion at the end. So our next talk is from Dr. Sophie Bennett. She's an academic clinical psychologist working at King's College London, Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, an honorary associate professor at the UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health. She's here to talk to us about mental health, early intervention for children and young people with epilepsy.
I'm going to start my timer and try not to take too long in my introductory session. I am talking about mental health. So in the talk today, thinking firstly about the relationship between epilepsy and mental health in children and young people. Then going to think a bit about what current provision looks like for treating those mental health difficulties before coming on to a trial that I've been involved in with lots of other people in the UK, looking at a model of integrated care that we could perhaps use to treat mental health difficulties within children with epilepsy. So in terms of mental health, I'm sure that most, if not all of you in the room will be familiar with the statistics that we know that mental health problems are much more prevalent in children and young people and in adults with epilepsy compared to the general population. So in this study, it was up to 7 times greater. There are different figures, but we know it's higher. In terms of why that might be, there's lots of different reasons, but this figure shows that it's really multifactorial, and it's going to be different for different children and young people. Overall, though, what we know is that mental health problems are more common in people who have brain disorders like epilepsy than in people who have other types of chronic illness. And so we think that that shows that there must be some type of direct neurobehavioral consequences of the epilepsy, so a direct brain behaviour link between the epilepsy and mental health. Why are we interested in thinking about mental health when we have had lots of talks demonstrating the many different adverse impacts of having epilepsy? And one of the biggest reasons is thinking about the impact of epilepsy on quality of life. So this is a figure that's taken from a study from Anne Berg that was done several years ago now, but I think illustrates really nicely why mental health is important in terms of impact on quality of life. So this is a group of young people with epilepsy, and across the bottom what you can see is different domains of quality of life, and going up the y-axis is quality of life. So the higher the number, the better the quality of life. When you take a group of people with epilepsy and you separate them by whether or not they have seizures, actually you can see that the quality of life across all of those different domains is really very similar. But if we take that same group of people and instead we separate them by whether or not they have a mental health disorder or a neurodevelopmental disorder, what you can see is that those who do have a mental health disorder have significantly worse quality of life than those who don't. So that would suggest that actually mental health difficulties have a bigger impact on quality of life than seizure frequency itself. And not only that, and we've obviously had some mention of this already this morning, but it impacts significantly on mortality. So not just in young people with epilepsy, but in young people more generally, suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst 15 to 29-year-olds worldwide. That's 8% of all deaths. In the UK, where I'm based, suicide is the leading cause of death in young people and accounts for 14% of deaths in 10 to 19-year-olds and 21% of deaths in 20 to 34-year-olds. The figure on the right comes from a report looking at suicide by children and young people in the UK, and that looks at reasons for suicide. At the bottom, you can see, perhaps not unexpectedly, that mental ill health is among those reasons, but two from the bottom, you can see that physical health conditions that might have a social impact also appears on that list. So suicide and epilepsy particularly, a recent study of children with epilepsy who lacked any prior psychiatric diagnosis, 11% expressed suicidality. I think bringing home the point that we do need to be assessing for this within clinic. And fear of the unknown and social factors like driving or other forms of independence, relationships, emotional support appear to affect young people more than it does adults. So we really need to be thinking about this particularly on our children and young people. This is a figure that comes from the same report that talked about the causes of suicide. And it discusses particularly preventative measures that we can take to reduce suicide in children and young people. And key in the bottom, and I guess the reason that I'm talking about it this morning, is thinking about the availability of child mental health services, including services for self-harm and substance misuse. So improving the availability of mental health services should reduce overall suicide rates. But the problem is that we know that those type of integrated mental health services are often not available for children and young people with epilepsy. So this is a figure that comes from the Epilepsy 12 National Audit of Epilepsy Services in England, but I think that the figure could look similarly for many places across the world. At the bottom, you can see the number of clinics that offer integrated mental health care provision, and that number is only 12.8%. So only 12.8% of clinics are able to offer mental health care provision from within their epilepsy clinic. So that means that mostly, if those difficulties are identified, which you know they're often not, we need to refer out. But what happens when we refer out to local child and adolescent mental health services? What we find is that actually many of those referrals may be rejected. So this is a study that comes from one of our students, Georgia Byrne, where we gave vignettes to different clinicians and asked them whether or not they would accept this referral for a young person with anxiety. The vignettes were exactly the same. The only thing that was different is there was one sentence for some clinicians where it said that the young person had epilepsy, and for others where it said the young person had a diagnosis of autism. And what happened was that the additional perceived complexity was frequently provided as a reason for rejecting those referrals and for not offering evidence-based practice. And clinicians also predicted the success of the intervention to be significantly lower for those children and young people. So that means that epilepsy services are really being left to treat the difficulties, but we know that most services don't have that integrated mental health care input. Even when there is that input, though, we know that if around 50% of children and young people attending epilepsy clinics might have mental health difficulties, then a model that's reliant on potentially expensive staff, like a psychologist, psychiatrist-led intervention, can be really difficult to scale because it's expensive, and there may be also a potential lack of sufficiently qualified staff globally. So that's where the MICE program that I was involved in comes into play. We set out to address the need for effective, evidence-based, scalable intervention, and we aim to do that through training epilepsy nurse specialists and assistant psychologists, who for us are kind of graduate psychologists who have an undergraduate degree in psychology but aren't fully qualified clinical psychologists, to deliver evidence-based mental health care under appropriate supervision. So it's been a long programme of work. There were 4 different work packages. The QR codes at the bottom, I don't know whether you'll be able to take photographs of them, but they have all the papers that we've published on this to date. So in the first work package, we took an existing mental health intervention and we developed it to be epilepsy specific. We then trained services and conducted a preliminary test of the intervention. And then we conducted a randomised control trial. We also have qualitative interviews with families that undertook the intervention, and that is in press now. So thinking about the trial itself and how we identify children and young people, we did use routine screening. So we used the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a standard measure of mental health used nationally within mental health services, not just epilepsy services. And that was conducted by families on a tablet when they came into the clinic waiting room. All families were invited to take part in that screening. And then for those who scored above a certain threshold on the SDQ, they would be invited to take part in an online diagnostic assessment, the Development and Wellbeing Assessment, or DORBA, which they could go home, complete that all online, and then press send, and that would be sent automatically to a clinician in our team, a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist, who could rate that DORBA for whether or not there was a mental health difficulty that would benefit from treatment. The intervention itself, we named the MICE intervention, the mental health intervention for children with epilepsy. And it takes an existing evidence-based modular intervention that was in line with our national guidance called Match ADTC. Some of you may be familiar with it in the States, and Bruce Chorpeter, who's one of the developers of Match, is actually based in LA. And we modified that treatment for children and young people with epilepsy. We then trained clinicians who didn't have significant prior experience of mental health intervention, so those epilepsy nurse specialists and assistant psychologists, to be able to deliver the treatment. And then, importantly, with those relatively inexperienced clinicians, we had to have a qualified supervisor and providing group supervision throughout. So we had a group of young people who received MICE and compared them with a group who received their usual care for mental health problems alone. In terms of the finer details of the trial, we had 334 3 to 18-year-olds, and we included young people who had intellectual disability and autistic children and young people. We felt it was really important to have that broad range because we wanted this to reflect the children and young people that we saw coming into our clinics, and because we know that there is unmet need throughout all of the children and young people, we didn't want to exclude anyone arbitrarily. They had to be attending epilepsy clinics and had to have a common mental health disorder, so anxiety, depression, or behaviour problems, according to that diagnostic assessment. So the results of our study. So this is the SDQ. So lower scores indicate fewer emotional behaviour difficulties. So what you want to see is lower scores. And what you can see with the MICE arm in pink and the control arm in grey is that the MICE arm do have lower scores at 6 months compared to the control arm. And that was statistically significant with a small effect size. And at 12 months, so 6 months after the intervention when they weren't receiving any additional mental health intervention, that effect size, if anything, got even bigger, with an effect size of 0.42. And that's equivalent on the SDQ to about 40% reduction in the likelihood of those children and young people meeting criteria for a mental health disorder. So also clinically significant. Importantly for us, we wanted to think about who benefited from the intervention. And this figure shows that actually children with intellectual disability and those without, children who are on the autistic spectrum and those who are not, boys, girls, older young people, younger young people, those with different mental health difficulties, they all benefited similarly from mice and all benefited more from mice than the control arm. So there's no reason that we should be excluding children, for example, with intellectual disability or autistic children and young people from receiving our interventions. Thinking about families' feedback, which for us was really the most important part of this. So this is one just very nice quote that illustrates what many of the families told us. If I could use an analogy to explain the effect the therapy had, it was like we were passing through a raging storm at sea, stuck on a boat with no sail, oars or tiller, and lost to what we could do to get through it. But the CBT, so that's the mice treatment, helped give us tools, instruments, ideas of things that we could do that were within our control. The strategies helped calm us all so that we could navigate that storm. And now we're almost on the other side of it. When I look back, I can see just how scary it was for the four of us stuck on that boat. Your work made such a difference to us, and I hope it will become standard in the future for all families with children who have epilepsy. So in terms of next steps, we were really pleased that actually we have made steps towards making this standard care within England. So we trained a number of services across England to deliver mice as part of commissioned National Health Service England pilots. And those pilots are going to be independently evaluated, so hopefully in future we'll be able to share with you what those results are when it's in usual clinical practice. We're also looking at data linkage, so with schools data and hospital admissions data, so that we can look at longer term outcomes of early mental health treatment. And finally looking to investigate mediators and moderators of treatment, so to work out who benefits from what intervention, who we should be offering which interventions to. We're really pleased that the paper was published earlier this year from the trial, and that big QR code, which hopefully you can take a picture of, will send you to the publication. So just to acknowledge all of the people that were involved. This was a big trial with many, many families who inputted right from the offset, from supporting us to develop the intervention through to those who participated in the trial, as well as all the researchers. So thank you very much for having me here. That's everything. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sophie. As a primarily basic science researcher, or a heavily basic science researcher, I like that you named your human intervention mice. All right, so next we're going to have Rama Maganti, if I can move these slides forward. Okay. Rama's a neurologist with training in epilepsy and sleep medicine. He's a professor of neurology at the University of Wisconsin Medicine. And he has a clinical practice in both sleep and epilepsy. And his research focuses on the interface. So he's going to talk to us today about mortality associated with disorders of sleep in persons with epilepsy.
Is there a laptop screen that I can see? Oh, I see.
Yeah, can you see that? Okay.
Oh, gotcha.
Got it?
Okay. Thank you. Clicker. All right. And I click this way. Gotcha. All right. Thank you very much, Gordon. I want to thank the organizers and for inviting me to speak here. This is my first time being at the PAME conference, and boy, it is. I learned a lot already from the parents who spoke. and I have a spinal cord disease, and I struggle to walk, and I fall a lot. But this condition allows me to talk to my patients because I can connect with them. You know, I walk into the room and I say, hey, I have a spinal cord disease. I'm Dr. Maganti, by the way. And that opens up, that lets people talk to me freely about their condition. So I'm not using it for that, but it helps me in that regard. But anyway, I'll talk about mortality associated with disorders of sleep in people with epilepsy. I do not have any disclosures. I'll talk briefly about understanding sleep complaints and sleep disorders that are common in patients with epilepsy, recognizing risk of mortality associated with sleep disorders, like obstructive sleep apnea, which is actually very common in people with epilepsy. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on understanding sleep-epilepsy interactions, specifically on sleep deprivation in epilepsy, how it is a detriment to seizures, and also talk about something called sleep homeostasis in people with epilepsy, and I'll show some of the recent unpublished work that we've been doing. Now, a lot of patients with epilepsy have sleep complaints. Large case series show about anywhere from up to 30-35% of patients with epilepsy have sleep complaints. Most of them report excessive daytime sleepiness, or at least you would think that people report excessive daytime sleepiness, but actually insomnia is a lot more common in people with epilepsy, and a lot of the insomnia is sleep maintenance insomnia, where they cannot stay asleep, but it can also be sleep onset insomnia, where they have trouble falling asleep. And a lot of patients also say they have poor quality of sleep. Now, this is not only common for patients themselves, but also actually for care providers. Sleep disturbances are very common in care providers because they're worried about their loved ones having a seizure in the middle of the night. Now, there are some sleep disorders that are very common in epilepsy. Obstructive sleep apnea is the most common. Insomnia, as I said, in a large proportion of patients. They also have restless leg syndrome. There are two others called REM sleep behavior disorder and non-REM parasomnia. REM sleep behavior disorder is also a parasomnia. Parasomnia is nothing but people who have abnormal behaviors or experiences during sleep. Now, sleep apnea is very common in a large meta-analysis. 40% of adults with epilepsy have sleep apnea, and that number is about 25% of children. It's a lot more common in males, those who are overweight. And it's actually much more common in people who have refractory epilepsy or somebody who's poorly controlled. Many of you are probably aware of the vagus nerve stimulator. Vagus nerve stimulator patients also have higher rates of sleep apnea, especially those who are on rapid cycling or higher duty cycles. There are some medications that can be associated with sleep apnea, benzodiazepines specifically, because they're skeletal muscle relaxants and they relax the airway muscle tone and it tends to collapse. And valproate is also another medication that's been implicated, especially because people gain weight. Now, there's some recent evidence that if people have sleep apnea and the hypoxia, or the drop in the oxygen saturation due to apnea itself, can lead to late onset epilepsy. In fact, this was evident from what's called as a sleep heart health study, which is a longitudinal study going on for many years now. In a 20-year follow-up, 26 out of 1,309 patients actually developed new onset epilepsy. And when they looked at which patients are these, and these are patients actually who had oxygen desaturations below 80%. So the hypoxia associated with sleep apnea can be associated with development of new onset epilepsy. Severity of the apneas, the number of arousals, the sleep duration was actually not associated with it. It's actually the drop in the oxygen saturation. What happens, people who have sleep apnea, for those of you who are unaware, they're treated with something called CPAP, which is a mask that they have to put on when they go to sleep, and there's a machine that blows air to sort of keep the airway open. Now, this is a study where on the right-hand side I show, people who have obstructive sleep apnea before they're on CPAP, they have a lot more spikes on their EEG, both while they're awake and they're asleep, and actually CPAP reduces it. And there's also another study that showed that patients who are treated with CPAP have higher seizure freedom rates than those who are untreated. So if you have, if someone with epilepsy has sleep apnea, it's really important that they be treated with CPAP, and that can be really beneficial for the patient in terms of their seizures themselves. Now, sleep apnea itself can be an independent risk factor for mortality, and usually the previous studies looked at what is known as all-cause mortality. And there's a table on the right-hand top I show where the risk ratios, so the hazard ratios associated with moderate to severe sleep apnea. So in patients who have moderate to severe sleep apnea, the word moderate and severe when it comes to sleep apnea is the number of apneas they have per hour during sleep. They have a 6-fold increase in all-cause mortality. Now, on the right-hand side at the bottom, I showed this where they looked at sudden death. This is actually data from the Olmsted County, which is where Mayo Clinic is. They took all patients who had sudden death, and they said, let's divide them in patients who had sleep apnea and who didn't have sleep apnea. It turned out a lot of the patients who had sleep apnea actually died between midnight and 6 a.m., which is, I think, where a lot of SUDEP happens too. Interestingly, when this study came out in 2005, around the same time, there was a Green Bay Packer. I live in Wisconsin, so people are really interested in the Green Bay Packers. There was a Green Bay Packer who had sleep apnea who suddenly died in his sleep. His name is Reggie White. And I got a barrage of patients because the wives were bringing my husband snores. I'm worried he's going to die. And this paper actually came out around the same time. So these patients die in the middle of the night, which is probably when a lot of patients with SUDEP die as well. So there may be a link there is all I'm saying. Now, the exact relationship between obstructive sleep apnea and SUDEP is not entirely known. There's one study that found a association between having sleep apnea and the SUDEP risk, which is devised by what is known as the SUDEP-7 inventory, which is a clinical characteristics that are each given a score. So the SUDEP-7 scores were much higher in patients who had AHI greater than 20, that is number of apneas greater than 20 per hour. But then there are two other studies that did not show that association between sleep apnea and the SUDEP-7 score. So that's for that reason I said, the exact relationship is not quite known. Now, I think there are large prospective studies that are needed to understand the risk of, the association between sleep apnea and SUDEP. And I think risk should be assessed based on the severity. But clearly, there's data from the cardiac standpoint. Using CPAP reduces cardiac arrhythmias, and cardiac arrhythmias have been implicated as one of the factors that causes SUDEP. So, CPAP may be helpful in reducing SUDEP is sort of an idea that I have. CPAP also has been shown to reduce all-cause mortality in people who have obstructive sleep apnea. Now, interestingly, Restless-Leg syndrome is also very common in people with epilepsy, and a lot of my patients tell me about it. It's actually, much higher, 11 to 33% in different studies. And it's more common, interestingly, in patients who have temporal lobe epilepsy. And there's this one study that looked at which type of temporal lobe epilepsy patients it's more common in. And it turns out those with right temporal lobe epilepsy often have restless legs. Restless legs is a pretty common condition. I'm sure there are at least 10 people in this audience here that have restless legs, and I'm one of those. So it's pretty common. Now, interestingly, there's one meta-analysis that showed that the risk of mortality in people with epilepsy is due to cardiovascular events. But the risk of SUDEP, with RLS is not known. It's probably significant, but there's no data on this. There are other sleep disorders that can happen in people with epilepsy, one of which is called REM sleep behavior disorder. This is where people act their dreams out and they can have wild flinging movements. Sometimes they jump out of bed, fall out of bed. But the prevalence of this in epilepsy is not entirely known. There's also another non-REM parasomnia called confusional arousals that is very difficult to distinguish from epilepsy. But the risk of mortality from these, I think this is uncommon, by the way, non-REM parasomnias, but the risk of mortality associated with these disorders is not entirely known. I'll touch on two other subjects. One is sleep deprivation, how it relates to SUDEP, and the other is called sleep homeostasis and how it relates to SUDEP. Sleep and epilepsy have a very complex relationship. On one hand, epilepsy disrupts sleep, and disrupted sleep is a very common trigger for people with seizures. In fact, many of the providers here, or even patients and their families, can tell if my son or my daughter doesn't sleep well, they have more seizures. And I'm sure a lot of the providers get that too. Now, there are a number of other factors here. It could be sleep disorders, sleep disruptions induced by seizures themselves, by medications, and then lifestyle factors where, they're spending too much time on their phone, not sleeping well, abnormal circadian rhythms. We just heard the speaker about depression. Depression can be associated with sleep disturbances. But the thought is that all of these kind of make this into a vicious cycle, maybe contributing mortality. I put a question mark because we don't know that relationship, but it's a hunch that this complex relationship actually drives mortality in people with epilepsy. As I said, sleep deprivation in epilepsy is caused by a variety of different things: sleep disorders, seizures, lifestyle factors, any of those. As I mentioned, it's very commonly reported by patients, and this is not only reported by those with focal epilepsies, but also generalized epilepsies, and especially common in people who have very poorly controlled seizures. Interestingly, when people come into the epilepsy monitoring unit, we sleep deprive them. There's one study that looked to see if sleep deprivation actually increases seizures, and this was done by Beth Mallow in Michigan. And strangely, the sleep deprivation in the monitoring unit did not exacerbate seizures. However, in the Mortimer study, the big study, or the most important study that most of you are familiar with, probably related to SUDEP, 15% of the patients reported, or the families reported, that they were sleep deprived immediately prior to their death. So we said, let's go to a mouse model and see if sleep deprivation actually increases seizures. In this particular mouse model where the mice have early mortality, on the right-hand top, I show how seizures increase with sleep deprivation, but then they tend to fall after the third day, because I think the mice get adjusted to our sleep deprivation thing that we're doing. Mice are very ingenious. And also, interestingly, it really accelerated the mortality in these mice. So I think sleep deprivation in this mouse model of SUDEP really accelerated mortality. So I think it's an important thing. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We looked at what mechanisms might be involved. We focused on something called GABAergic inhibition. There are a couple of different types of inhibition. The most important thing is tonic inhibition is the biggest, most of the inhibition in the brain is afforded by tonic inhibition. So any change in tonic inhibition really increases excitability in the brain, causing more seizures. That was the idea behind this, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Now, we also decided to look at patients from the Center for SUDEP Research. A number of the people here, like Dr. Bateman, Dan Friedman, others are all involved in this Center for SUDEP Research. Now, because SUDEP happens during sleep, I always felt that there must be something in sleep that can tell us, in which patient this is going to happen. So as part of this Center for SUDEP Research, they had data on like over 4,000 patients, 40 of whom later died of SUDEP sometime after their EEG monitoring in the hospital. So we took those 40, and we took 40 patients who are classified as high risk for SUDEP, 40 patients who are low risk for SUDEP, and 40 patients who did not have epilepsy. And we said, let's look at their sleep-wake patterns first of all. And on the right-hand side is the data showing the sleep-wake patterns in these people. And we said, when we looked at the overall sleep-wake patterns, this is only one night of EEG study, by the way. There were no differences in the sleep-wake patterns. Then we said, let's see if their sleep is fragmented. And we came up with a number, a numerical way of identifying sleep fragmentation. And the patients who later died of, the 40 patients who died of SUDEP had a lot more fragmented sleep. So that was a big thing. So sleep fragmentation is important. Then the second thing is something that I'm interested in called sleep homeostasis. What is sleep homeostasis? Well, the longer you stay awake, the more sleepy you get, right? That's homeostasis. Now, once you sleep, your pressure to sleep declines. That's homeostasis. And when you sleep deprived, you sleep more intensely and you sleep longer. That's homeostasis. So these are all the three factors. We said, let's look at this. And it's measured with something called the power in delta activity or slow wave activity on their EEG. Now, normally, the slow wave activity is high at the beginning of the night and it declines. And as you can see, on the right-hand side, what is data from each patient. On the top is no epilepsy control. The second one is somebody who's at low risk of SUDEP, then a high risk, and then a patient who actually died of SUDEP. Now, for each patient on the top is their sleep-wake pattern is shown it's a graphic representation of their different stages of sleep. And on the bottom, the black areas is each non-REM episode and their delta and the power in the slow wave activity. As you can see on the no epilepsy control, the slow wave activity declines overnight. It starts much higher and declines overnight. When you go to the low risk, it still declines, but it's a bit lower. When you go to the high-risk patient, it's almost flat, and it's way lower. And the patient who had SUDEP, it actually goes the opposite way. Now, what is the importance of this? Now, normally, if you're sleeping, your pressure to sleep should decline. In the SUDEP case, it doesn't decline. It actually goes the opposite. It's as if the person never slept. The sleep pressure continued to increase throughout the night. Now, this is only one night, and I wonder if we monitored this chronically, we probably could tell patients which patient is at really, really high risk of SUDEP. But I think this has to be done longitudinally. We probably have to do it several times across time. So we looked at, this is continuing this same data. On the left-hand side figures, the top one is group analysis. So it's taking all 40 patients. It seems like the normal control, the low risk, and the high risk, their overnight delta, the slow wave activity declines, whereas the SUDEP group goes up. Then we said, let's see if there's a difference in males and females. On the left-hand side bottom, I'm showing you a difference between males and females. It seems like this homeostatic decline in slow wave activity is much worse in males. That means probably males are at higher risk of SUDEP. And that's supported by other studies which showed that number of males who died of SUDEP was higher than females, actually. And then on the right-hand side is we said, let's take these patients, divide them on their proximity to mortality. So we divided the patients that died after their EEG monitoring 0 to 2 years, 2 to 4 years, 4 to 6 years, when they died. And we said, let's see if there is a progressive change in their sleep homeostasis that tells us who's at mortality. And lo and behold, it showed that there is this sleep homeostasis decline or the loss actually progressively worsens as mortality approaches. So the closer they are to mortality, the worse is their sleep homeostasis. So what is the consequence of impaired sleep homeostasis? Well, sleep homeostasis is required to recuperate or catch up from lost sleep. And if you don't have a normal homeostasis, you probably will accumulate sleep debt chronically, and that has a potential to continue to worsen seizures and probably contributes to mortality as well. So that's the importance of impaired sleep homeostasis. We did 2 studies in the past. On the left-hand side is work done by Melanie Bowley, one of my colleagues, who looked at the slow wave activity on a human EEG when patients are monitored. And in this particular study, we showed that patients with epilepsy actually displayed an increase in slow wave activity power during dream sleep and during non-REM sleep in widespread brain areas. So what we saw, what I showed you previously in the CSR database is not surprising, it's not different. On the right-hand side is work done by Christina Simeone in Creighton, where in this mouse model of SUDEP, she looked at sleep because these mice were dying fast at a younger age. So she took the data from the date of death, looking back to the amount of time they spent sleeping or resting. And it turned out these mice, their sleep progressively declines as mortality approaches. So it seems like sleep debt that people accumulate, or the mice accumulate anyway, kind of culminates in mortality. So it's kind of, I want to show you these data because I think it's consistent with what we found in the Center for SUDEP Research database. Well, how do we treat the problem? Well, I think it's very important for providers to screen patients for sleep issues, sleep complaints. A simple question, how do you sleep, by the way, is all it takes. I think that's where it can begin, I suppose. And you'd be surprised how many details come out by asking that simple question. Screening patients for sleep apnea, physicians commonly use what is called a stop-bang questionnaire about snoring, weight gain, hypertension, those kinds of things. I think screening for other sleep disorders such as insomnia and restless legs is also important. And I think telling patients of the importance of sleep is very, very important. There's one study that came out, reminded me, about a year ago, where they found that if the patient slept an average of 1.25 hours a night, the chances of their seizures happening sort of dramatically declines. It was in Lancet Neurology. I remember seeing this paper. There are a variety of different medications available for patients who struggle with insomnia. There are what are known as dual orexin antagonists. There are 3 different drugs that are actually FDA approved that I listed them down there. All these drugs, they not only help insomnia, they don't hurt epilepsy. In fact, if anything, they actually help epilepsy. Because there are mouse studies that showed that animal studies that showed that using these drugs are helpful for epilepsy in different models. I think improving sleep and sleep homeostasis is important. How do we do that? There are drugs, especially the orexin antagonists, or drugs that can actually enhance sleep homeostasis. There's ample evidence of that. There's also there are adenosine is another target. There are drugs that target adenosine that are in the process of being developed. These drugs may help the sleep homeostasis as well. In fact, sleep homeostasis, the chief chemical in the brain that is responsible for the homeostatic function, is felt to be adenosine. That's the reason why I brought it up. Of course, suppressing seizures is really important. That can help their sleep problems as well. I think I will stop there. I hope I brought up some points on importance of proper sleep in people with epilepsy and how it provides some insights on things that can be done from a sleep perspective to reduce the risk of mortality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maganti. And we're going to take a few minutes for questions. Can I please have the members of our panel come back up, Dr. Hirsch, Dr. Bennett, and Kelly? I think there's probably a microphone going around somewhere, but if I see hands in the middle just behind you here.
Hi.
Oh,
yeah,
one here
thank you very
first.
much for a great talk. So I have a question regarding your surrogate marker of sleep homeostasis. Have you checked the influence or the impact of the daily drug dose on the EEG features that you have measured?
Yeah, so we looked at the different frequency spectrum on the EEGs, but we haven't looked at whether epileptiform activity, how it influences sleep homeostasis, is not something we have examined. Now, scoring this sleep on this many patients on their EEG is a humongous task. So we actually resorted to an automated sleep scoring algorithm, and we validated it in our patients and sort of used that so that we can derive their frequency spectrums, and but we haven't looked at how seizure activity or epileptiform activity influenced that. The one thing we did, however, is we eliminated any night that a patient had seizures.
Tom.
I'm just going to take the mic runner's privilege here to make a quick comment of thanks to Kelly for sharing her story and sharing Reese and everything with you and Rob and Corey. So I did want to ask you, in terms of changing the standard of care with screening, if you had any comments or thoughts about ways to do that, both in your state of Washington and on a broader level.
When I worked with the neurology office that Reese saw for care, they initially said that they discussed with the neighboring neurology clinics, and the standard was just to ask about mood. So I went a little mama bear in that moment, and I said, no, you need to be the trailblazer. Let's do this. And they did. And to make change in healthcare is hard. It's hard to do. And it was a slow process. Like, it was hard to be patient. But just shy of a year since Reese passed, they implemented, I think it's the PHQ-9 depression and suicide screening within their clinics. And any platform that I am able to speak, I ask for screening because I'm becoming involved more with the Epilepsy Foundation. I'm writing to our legislators to ask for that to be a mandated requirement in our clinics. in the state. So those are things that I've kind of been encouraging, and like, why can't we be the trailblazers? And I loved the research that was presented, because I daydream about a social worker or a psychotherapist in a neurology office. I do daydream about that, and how wonderful that would be as a part of receiving this overwhelming diagnosis, and how are these young people supposed to navigate their life in the most normal way that they can. I think that would be just amazing to see that happen.
I'm going to take a platform prerogative and ask Dr. Bennett, just following up on that. One of the things we see as epilepsy care providers is that time and again, this difficulty with receiving mental health care from trained mental health professionals, either because there's this illusion that epilepsy is such a sacred disease that the only thing that can ever happen to you is totally related to the epilepsy, and then also the concerns about aggravating the epilepsy with medication treatments for a variety of psychiatric disorders. How have you been able to navigate that, or have you been able to navigate that in the UK?
I think we have the same issue, so I don't know whether I have all the answers. I think one of the things, so I didn't really have time to describe how we developed the intervention in this talk, but we did spend a year meeting with families and with professionals and kind of developing it iteratively. So they had lots of say in what it looked like. And one of the things that we developed with families was a frequently asked questions document, and that had exactly that. That's some of the questions or myths really around, I think that the medication needs to change before my child's mental health difficulties will be able to be managed, or for clinicians, is it even possible to treat mental health difficulties in the context of epilepsy? Do they not just come as part and parcel and there's nothing that we can do about it? And having a document that really answers those myths. So I think they still exist, and we've got to advocate, for our patients that we can treat these difficulties.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi there, my name's Lauren. I'm an epilepsy fellow at Sick Kids. Building on that question that you had, and firstly, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing the story of your son, and I think it's really educational for all of us to sort of hear these stories and see the process that people go through. Building on that question, I feel like implementing the questionnaires is something that we can do in clinics, but the next step is often where it gets challenging in terms of what do we do with these questionnaires if they're positive, if we don't have access to the mental health supports? So I was wondering, Dr. Bennett or Kelly, if you can comment on what you would advise a medical provider in those situations where we might not have the supports, or what supports you think would be the most beneficial to prioritize for our patients. And then I really did like that mouse model that you showed, and I was wondering, Dr. Bennett, is that something that's publicly available to clinics to implement, or is it something that is still within the research realm?
Do you want to go first? Or?
I think that in the starts of screening, there's going to be need to develop policy of what to do with a higher score. If there's the nurse, office nurse in place that can help navigate referrals to outside sources, if there's not a therapist on staff, which most of the time there's not going to be that, but if they can help navigate and get those referrals out to the children's therapists that work within the hospital setting that the neurology clinic might be affiliated to. But definitely it does take time, and that's why it did take a whole year to develop that policy of now what do we do when we have these screenings of what to do with these kids that are in need of more assistance. So I think that is a barrier, and that if we could get to the point where therapists were within the clinic, I think that would be just such a collaboration that would help serve our epilepsy patients so much more in a well-rounded area.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I guess there's different ways to think about post screening. So ideally we would have those mental health professionals within the clinic that can manage that. I think one of the reasons that we trained epilepsy nurses was also that they are trained in risk management, so not necessarily the kind of mental health intervention, but how to manage risk if there is kind of imminent suicide risk, for example. There are also, I guess, self-help resources that are not developed for epilepsy specifically, but that can be effective for mental health problems more generally. Epilepsy charities that people can be signposted to, so potentially setting up resource packs or referral pathways within your kind of locality to be able to make use of the resources that you do have available to you. In terms of the resources that are available, I think I'm happy for people to contact me about kind of the availability of mice. We've only really just published it this year, so we're still trying to work out exactly how we go about disseminating it. We're keen for as many young people to be able to access evidence-based treatment as possible. You know, that's the reason that we did the study. So I'm very happy for people to contact me and we can take it from there.
Yeah. Hi. To all of you, thank you so much for everything that you just covered. Kelly, thank you for sharing that story as well. Really. Sophia, I have a specific question for you. I grew up with epilepsy, and I never told my doctor the truth that I had depression. I hid it because I had enough wrong with me. And I didn't want the doctor telling me I was wrong about something else. I forgot to take my medication. That's why I have refractory seizures. That's just an example. I don't tell the truth, and neither do a lot of your patients. Have you ever, and this is a question actually for all of you, but have you ever considered specific epilepsy diagnoses to go hand in hand with anxiety and depression? For example, I had left temporal lobe epilepsy. Temporal lobe physiologically controls mood. Is there a connection?
I mean, I think in summary that we know that there is that brain behavior connection. I have to say that I don't feel expert enough to be able to say exactly kind of the relationship between different epilepsies and mental health difficulties. But I think that similarly in kind of when people ask us whether they need to wait to be on a different medication to have the mental health difficulties treated, I think yes, there might be specific epilepsies that are more or less associated with mental health difficulties, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to do something about the mental health difficulties themselves. I know that that's not what you're saying, but I think that it's something that people kind of come back to us with. Yes, people may not be able to feel that they can disclose their mental health difficulties within a clinic, and I guess that's one of the reasons that we think using a screener might be helpful, because it's potentially less stigmatizing to see that information written down. You know, other people experience this, but also a lot of the families told us that they'd never approached their clinician for mental health treatment for their child because they didn't realize that epilepsy was associated with mental health difficulties, and they felt blamed and stigmatized enough as it was for the epilepsy, and for the parents they felt, you know, maybe it's something wrong with my parenting. So actually within that frequently asked questions document, being able to just say, actually we know that lots of young people with epilepsy will have mental health problems. That's not the fault of you, it's not the fault of your parents, it is nobody's fault. It's just one of those things that we know happens with epilepsy, but there is something that we can do about it. So I think that, again, tackling stigma is really important for that.
I have a quick question for Dr. Hirsch. What do you think was the driving factor in reducing the ICU stay with rapid EEG?
Presumably it was just earlier treatment for those in status. And if they looked in the subgroup who actually had seizures on it, it was an even more dramatic. I think it was 4 days versus 13 days. So presumably it's just because the earlier you diagnose non-convulsive status, the easier it is to treat.
And also maybe a little confidence in like pushing hard?
Yeah, it certainly could be. Although I will point out one of the best uses of the rapid EEG is to avoid giving medication. There's a lot of times that people think, oh, they might be seizing, they want to give more. They get the EEG, it shows nothing, they don't. That's actually more common than increasing meds.
Oh,
that's been studied. So.
Great. Thanks.
Following to that, can I just ask you another more practical question? We hear a lot, aborting seizures early, stopping the status before it sets in is important, and we have all these home community available medications to give, but yet we often hear from people, they're already having a seizure, they're really sedated, they seem really out of it, I'm afraid to give this medicine because it's more sedating. And then they're going to end up in the hospital because I gave the medicine and not from the seizures. How do you advise people to balance that?
Yeah, thanks. So there was a New England Journal paper many years ago looking at giving benzos or not on the way to the hospital for people with convulsive status. And yeah, it showed lorazepam was the best and stop seizing more. But the most important thing I think that study showed was that respiratory difficulties were cut in half by giving benzodiazepines compared to not giving anything. So if someone is seizing, giving something to stop it, even if it's a sedating drug, will actually lower the chances of any respiratory problems. So that's the most important. If they're seizing, they're seizing, giving it is going to actually lower their risk of respiratory issues. And now we have very reassuring data with the home treatments, the nasal benzos, that the chances of a significant respiratory problem is extremely small when it's used according to proper dosing and all of that. So I don't think the risk is zero, but it's very small. I think it's much less than the risk of letting them seize longer.
Okay, all right, let's take one more from the audience.
Hi, my name's Kim Pargin. I'm an epileptologist here in Los Angeles. I trained under Dr. Hirsch at Columbia many years ago. I also have 2 degrees in psychology. And our clinic actually does do the screening questionnaire, but I now work for LA County, like Libby. And one of the things I find frustrating is that for my patients, especially patients with very little medical literacy, is actually getting them the resources to see somebody. In our system, the patients we give them a list, and they have to call those clinics themselves, which doesn't work at all. Any thoughts on how you guys have dealt with healthcare disparities, in your careers, your experience? Because that's one of the big frustrations I have.
I can just say one thing we did at our place, we got a community health worker to help with things like that, so they can sit with them and actually make those calls with them. They don't need any particular training. It's not a nurse or a social worker. It's just a community health worker who's trained to do those things. So I don't know if other people have done that, but. Actually, it was through our local Epilepsy Foundation helped us do that. So.
Okay, sure.
Hi there. I appreciate you guys being here today. My name's James. I'm actually a bereaved parent of my little girl. But this question actually is for Dr. Maganti, and I'm actually a pharmacist by trade, and so the pharmacology of understanding it all, looking at some of the recent developments of, I know we were talking about mental health, but looking at some of the, theory of serotonin, in regards to it being a very important protective pathway for those with seizures. Do you see maybe a possible correlation where parents could try an unlabeled usage of like a SSRI to help, prevent or decrease the risk of SUDEP?
We have 2 experts right here who do work on that, or specifically on that area. So I think it's more appropriate if they answer this question.
Sure.
I'll let Dr. Buchanan go first. He has done a lot of this work in animal models of SUDEP and focused a lot on serotonin systems and how that might be important.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Serotonin is often a topic that we talk about a lot at PAME. We weren't planning on it as much this year, I guess, but I don't think we're at a place where we're ready to have that conversation yet. I think there's a lot of potential risks associated, and probably more work still needs to be done. This is my opinion as both researcher and a clinician. But I think it is a really good thought. I think a lot of the work that we're doing, that is on our mind, that we're hoping to get to something like that. Could there be a relatively simple intervention that we could use to try to help reduce the risk. And so I think we're definitely working towards that. I'm not sure, I don't think we're there yet to make that a recommendation.
If we look at human patients with epilepsy, there have been a few studies just looking at SSRIs, and a couple of things we've seen from the animal models is impacts on both arousal and respiration. In human patients with epilepsy, we have seen that for some individuals who are taking SSRIs, there is less respiratory impairment associated with the seizures. So those oxygen level drops that Dr. Maganti was talking about related to sleep apnea are less profound for some seizures. Some of the data in at least one of the studies suggests that that effect may not be as pronounced for generalized tonic-clonic seizures, which is the type of seizures that we worry most about with relation to SUDEP. But we don't have any clear evidence yet that this prevents SUDEP, though, as Dr. Buchanan said, it's a very active area of research and interest.
All right, thank you for that question. So I think we should wrap up here and go to, are you going to come back up and say anything?
Yeah. Okay. So we're due for a break. Everyone, please go out, have a coffee and everything. I'd just like to, again, thank all of our speakers. Dr. Buchanan, Dr. Hirsch, and I are old hats at PAME, but everyone else on this panel is a newcomer, and we're very happy to have them join us today. And thank you all for your attention and your questions.
Thank you all. So just a reminder, the break is for 15 minutes. You can get coffee and whatnot that way. And then the science breakout will be in the room over there, and bathrooms are there. And then the advocacy session is here. Thank you.